Hello, everyone. We are welcoming people in. I can see people are joining now. So thank you for being with us today for this FaceTime session with Dr. Gerry Samson. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Samson to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Jed Best. So Dr. Samson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, this particular issue of the fireside chat FaceTime has to do with glass ionomer cements in the use in pediatric dentistry, which I think you're all aware of. But what you may not be aware of is that Jed Best, a very close and longtime friend, is not only in my opinion, but also in Kevin Donnelly's opinion, uh, very possibly the world's authority in the clinical use of these materials and why they should be used that way. So, as you will see, Jed is really quite expert in not only the biochemistry of the materials, the engineering of the materials, but the actual clinical use. Jed, you were in private practice in New York City. Hold on, let me back up a minute. Where'd you go to dental school?
Case Western Reserve,
And when did you finish there?
81.
And then next?
Residency, University of Minnesota, finished 2 years later.
And that was in pediatric dentistry.
Yeah, and I won a graduate student research award there.
You have kind of Jed is remarkably interested in things that I don't know about the rest of the dentists that are watching this, but dental materials was something I mean, I would really rather gnaw on a doorknob than, I mean, dental materials. The only reason I think I passed that class, Jed, is I'm certain I cheated. Because the guy next to me almost failed as well. I think he was cheating off of me, who was cheating off of him. I mean, it was really, it's, well, but I digress. So, yeah, but you're quite interested in engineering principles. Didn't you? You're just a few credit hours short of something in bioengineering, aren't you?
Yeah, I started a master's in biomedical engineering while I was in dental school. So I'm one course in my thesis shy.
Yeah, kind of incredible. That Jed's, and you were in private practice in Manhattan for how long?
Um, all of it.
All of it,
So
which
I'm
is how
clearly a
many years?
masochist, right?
Yeah, for how many years?
Was it 42?
42 years in private practice. So you're not just talking to somebody who has an incredible interest and ability to explain research and the reasons behind why things are done, but also Jed is quite gifted in um, in the clinical application because it is what he did. He didn't tell other people what to do. It's what he was doing. Um, Jed, tell us about another interest of yours, probably having to do with the image that people see right now.
I'm basically truth be told, I'm an award-winning semi-professional professional photographer.
And just a few places you've gone on photo expeditions or safaris. Time wouldn't allow you to say all of them, but give us the top three most interesting.
North Pole, South Pole, Namibia, Iceland.
So the North and South Pole, after Jed did that, a few close friends, he actually had a book printed called My Bipolar Experience.
Right.
Yeah.
You've got a copy.
Yeah, I have a copy. And didn't you have something to do? You like to drive cars real fast, don't you?
I race a Porsche.
So, not just another pretty face. Jed Best, what do you have for us today?
Well, thank you, Gerry. So, before we get to discuss glass ionomers, I've listed on the title slide my phone number and my email address. So if anyone listening has any questions, that's how you can contact me. If you put down in the subject title fireside, I'll know you heard it from here, and I will return your email probably less than 24 hours. If you don't put it down, it may take me a couple of days because I'm kind of busy. And I'm busy because I still teach, and I teach at University of Alabama, Birmingham. I teach at Columbia. I teach at Case in Cleveland still. And as we speak, I do research at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia on dental materials with a fellow named Richard Price, some of whose slides you'll see. in case anyone's curious, this is northern Norway, north of the Arctic Circle, and the little red buildings are old fishermen huts that are now used as hotels. When anyone talks to you about materials, specifically with mentioning brand names, I urge you all not to believe us and to do your due diligence and go on openpayments.cms.gov, which is the federal government. You might distrust them about a lot of stuff, but anybody who gets any money from industry, the industry has to forward that over to the government. It started a long time ago when physicians were getting paid by pharmaceutical firms for pushing various drugs, and their patients didn't know that they were being compensated by industry. Excuse me. So you should really double check anybody who mentions a brand name. You want to know whether or not they're getting any money. I've simplified the slide for you for a bit, so you can see that the orange is basically anybody that's in healthcare, subdivided by specialty in terms of dentistry versus medicine versus occupational therapy, et cetera. The green line is the specialty mean of what specialists are getting. And then the bottom line is just the reference. And you can see that in the last time anything was entered for me was 2020, I got a whopping 46 bucks. In addition, in the spirit of true transparency, you shall know that, I'm doing this because I was asked by my good friend, Dr. Samson, and Fireside has been kind enough to compensate me for my time, which now that I am retired from practice always helps. It buys me a bottle of wine. I also want you to know about the following, because this is very important as of the last several weeks. With all of what's going on in Washington, D.C., there are two ways that products and devices get approved by the U.S. government. One is by the FDA, otherwise known as, which I will show you in a minute, a 510K or a PMA. And the other is, it's called the ISO standard, which stands for the International Standards Organization. That group has designated ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, to create all of the standards that are coming out of the US. And ANSI has designated the ADA to be the developer of those standards. To give you a quick example, there is at the moment no ISO standard for AI diagnosis of caries anywhere in the world. That group is meeting in 2.5 weeks in New York at the AADOCR meeting to hopefully solidify those standards. Whether the FDA, with their shortage of manpower, is going to be able to keep up with all of what is going on in terms of certifying or clearing various products remains to be seen. So if you want to be safe, if a salesman comes into you and is trying to push a new product, just ask them whether or not it's sold in the common market. You cannot buy anything in the common market that is not ISO cleared. If it's cleared in the common market, you're safe to use it in the US. And with respect to that, there are two major divisions or distinctions that you need to know about. One's called a PMN, otherwise known as a 510K. That's most of what goes on in dentistry. It basically means that the manufacturer can say it's cleared or it's listed, not that it's approved. A PMA, pre-market approval, is much more like the COVID vaccines. It's a far more extensive background that you have to do. For a PMN, all you have to do is prove that a previous product has already been cleared by the FDA, and the FDA will usually clear your product. That's why it's called a predicate. Excuse me. So let's talk about resins first, because we can't talk about glass ionomers unless we talk about some of the disadvantages of resins. I apologize for having to swallow some water, but I've got a cold, so I need to fight the dryness in my throat. Unbeknownst to all of us, there are such things as nit lines in resins. This is a scanning microscope photograph of it, care of Dr. Richard Price. This is going to increase your hypersensitivity of your resins. It's going to decrease the strength of the resins, and you will never know it, because unless you take the tooth out of the mouth and section the tooth, you're not going to see these nit lines. In addition, a very creative study that was done 2 years ago in Georgia, where they took a whole bunch of dental students and full-time faculty, the Dental College of Georgia, excuse me. And what they did is they color-coded 3 separate increments of resin, anywhere between 1.75 and 2.25 millimeters thick. And they wanted to determine whether or not the dentists or dental students could identify the increments in the proper size. And a third, which included full-time faculty, could not designate whether the fragment was too short, proper length, or too long. And the increment that they all guessed wrong was the first one, which is the one at the base closest to the dentin.
So the implication of that, Jed, in a clinical standpoint, what would be the bottom line inclination for that?
Well, the bottom line, I'm going to argue that there's a material out there that you do not have to worry whether the bottom is set or the top is set, because it does it all by itself, like by bottom line acid-base chemistry. And that's glass ionomer. And then the question is, how can we make the glass ionomer set faster so that it becomes more clinically effective for you as the clinician? And I'm going to show you that halfway through the talk.
Excellent.
Now, additionally, we know that the caries around restorations is a major problem. That's where it leaks. That's where you get demineralization and secondary caries. A few years ago, there was a brand of resin that was released on the US market that had a quaternary amine in it to help be antibacterial. To the best of my knowledge, that material is no longer on the market. I've checked all the major suppliers, Shine, Patterson, Benko, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, I do know that the previous head operating officer left and went to another company. So as to the best as I can tell, that attempt, while well-meaning, was a commercial failure. And the reason for that is the following. That looks pretty good, I assume, to everybody, except for the staining along the margins. So one would say that that's going to hold up and do well. Sorry. Unfortunately, the base of that resin is uncured resin. That resin will wash out. You won't know it. You won't know it till it's washed out enough that you're going to see it on film. That will probably be too late. The patient will have already been susceptible to secondary caries, to hypersensitivity. That's a problem with resins. Can your curing light reach the resin at the bottom of the box? Keep that thought in mind. This slide comes courtesy of 3M, now called Solventum. These are two separate cases where at the base of the box, the resin never cured. And it was exposed to a proper curing light. So you can see on the left, it's in the corner of the box, and the one on the right, it's basically the entire box is uncured resin. Now, Richard Price, when he developed this mold, as you can see, it folds. You can place the resin into the mold, cure it to see how well it does. And then you can put it in solvent and see if the resin that you think is solid is solid. And in fact, in this case, you can see that the base of the box on both sides, what would be the mesial and distal of that resin, is washed away. So how deep can the light go? Let's take a 1400 milliwatt light. That means down at the base of the box, at best, you might have 600 milliwatts of energy. Is that enough energy to cure your composite? You won't know. Manufacturers don't tell you. Go look at the side of your compules and see if it says how much energy is necessary. On top of which, that's a significant different distance away from the top of the light. The light can't reach all the way down there. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a material that you could place at minimum to replace the dentin in the box? And you would know no matter what you do that that material would get hard. Here are three separate specimens. One's done with a Monet, which is an LED curing light. The Power Cure and the G4 are traditional LED curing lights. And you can see that in each case, part of the resin dissolved away once exposed to the solvent because it was not cured. Again, you're not going to know this as a clinician until the patient comes back and complaining. And maybe if you take an X-ray, you might see it or you might not. There may be enough resin still there that is not cured, that is still radio opaque, and you're not going to be able to see the difference in the density between a cured resin and an uncured resin. Excuse me. In addition, are you curing down the long axis of the tooth? So this is a slide that just shows that if you are not curing down the long axis of the tooth, if you're curing from the buccal or the lingual or obliquely, you're creating what are called shadow areas, and those are areas where the resin is not getting cured. It gets worse. So the light on the right is a velo light. The light on the left is a more traditional bent light. We treat children for a living, or I did. You can see that on the left, that light, there's no way that light's going to be able to go down the long axis of the tooth. On the right, the velo can, and there are other lights besides the velo that are very straight that you can place in a child's mouth that will cure entirely down the long axis of the tooth. Wouldn't it also be nice if you had a material that you didn't have to go down the long axis of the tooth to make the material get hard? Keep that thought. This was a study done that was published in the Journal of the Canadian Dental Association in 2018. And what they were concerned about proved that most of these resins do not affect the biostability and interactions with biofilms, and biofilms are still a problem. Again, going back to that resin that I told you about that had cautionary amines was a way of preventing this problem. That material is not even on the market. So what do you do? This is us, isn't it? This is what we normally do when we're looking. Well, one positive, we've got a rubber dam on, but the dentist is looking away. Not only is the dentist looking away, if you look carefully at the light is not going down the long axis of that patient's tooth. The cure shield on top of the light is way too small, and the patient has clear glasses. So the blue blocker on the light's insufficient to protect anyone. And if the patient happened to have been a little kid watching the dentist do the work with holding a mirror, that patient's eyes are not protected because the light is clear. The glasses are clear, and they're not wearing blue blockers. Now, what happens if you're curing and you're not curing down the long axis of the tooth? Well, these are various diagrams of what the energy coming out of a light looks like depending upon the angle of deflection of the light. So on the top, there's no deflection. The light is going clearly through the long axis of the tooth. And on the bottom, there's a 20-degree deflection. And you can see very clearly that the cone changes. So take the blue phase as a perfect example. We go from a cone that actually has some sort of pyramid shape to it to a shape that's totally inverted. So if you're using this and you're not going down the long axis of the tooth, as an example, the center of the composite resin is not being cured nearly to the extent that the side of the composite is. You're not going to know it because the problem doesn't surface itself at the surface. It shows itself deeper into the penetration of the resin material. So let's talk about glass ionomers. Now let's talk about their past. Were they great when they first came out? Well, glass ionomers have never been super popular in the United States. We should note that Bonacor in the United States developed acid etching roughly in 1955 and released the first resin composite commercially roughly around 1962. Glass ionomers weren't released or developed, until 1965 by Wilson and Kent in the UK. And what are they? Well, they're an aluminofluorosilicate powder that's combined with a water-soluble polymer. The problem is it's got long setting times. It had poor wear resistance, and it had poor fracture strength. But, and it's a big but, their coefficient of thermal expansion was exactly similar to what the dentin structure is. So as the tooth contracts and expands when exposed to cold or to heat, the dentin kept up pace. And additionally, most of the bonding is not micromechanical like it is with a resin. It's a pure chemical bond. Now, if you're using a primer, that primer will etch the enamel or dentin to some extent. It's minor, but you've got pure chemical bonding and keeping the seal of the dentin intact. It's also biocompatible, and it also releases fluoride.
Hey, Allison, do we have is there a chat that's open that I'm not seeing if people have questions?
There is along the bottom. You can either send a chat in, or we've got a Q&A button as well. So if you have any questions throughout, you can definitely use that.
Okay. Also, I will mention that Jed is quite generous with his time. If you follow what he said when he first started, if you have specific questions, he is quite generous about this. If you email him the question, the other thing I'll mention to you, now that you've had about 15 or 20 minutes to see how well he can express these things, first I would say this, as a dentist, we all want to be absolutely confident we're doing the very best, which means using the very best materials. Secondly, I'll mention to you that if you contact Jed, if you're interested in having him speak with your organization, I'll say either virtually or live, he's quite happy to consider that. Jed?
Oh, okay. So key also is that there's fluoride release. Now, it's somewhat questionable how much fluoride is released, but there is a steady state of fluoride releasing. In fact, if you look at a glass ionomer restoration that's failed, part of it's popped out of the box, and you take an X-ray, you'll notice that the DEJ line has become far denser white than the other area. And that is because that area has remineralized from the fluoride release of the glass ionomer in towards the DEJ. And what's also really important is that it doesn't make a difference how you supply the fluoride to the patient. So if a parent, for sake of argument, is against water fluoridation, but they'll use a fluoridated toothpaste, that's enough of a source to supply fluoride for the glass ionomer. If they don't want fluoridated toothpaste, but they'll use a fluoride mouthwash, same thing holds. That's enough to get embellished into the glass ionomer and subsequently released. So I wanted to list for you some of the traditional glass ionomers that were out in the sort of first couple of generations. There was Keitac Molar, and then there came Keitac Universal, which was a higher powder liquid ratio one. There's been Fuji 9, which is also a higher powder liquid ratio. There was Chemfill Rock, which was unfortunately very slow setting. And then they're the ones that had silver incorporated into them, which was Riva Silver, Keitac Silver, and Miracle Mix. Miracle Mix came from GC. Riva is a company in Australia, which we will get to later on. I used to use them all the time. It took a lot of talking parents out of the fact that they weren't happy that they weren't white. Let me show you what they look like. And I practiced in Manhattan. So having someone look at their child's teeth wasn't sufficient. They basically had to take their eyeball, stick it in the kid's mouth, and look to make sure that the tooth was aesthetic. This is not aesthetic. But you can also see that in this case, the box is very wide beyond ideal angles for an amalgam or a resin restoration, but they stay intact because of the chemical bonding. So let's talk now about the glass ionomers that are present. Anyone is curious, this is the skyline from 57th Street from Central Park. So what have been the improvements in glass ionomers? Well, the very first one was the introduction of a photopolymerizable resin, otherwise known as Vitrabond, not Vitramier, Vitrabond. The keys were that you could cure it on demand. It had improved handling because of the resin component of it. And because of the resin component, it also improved wear resistance and strength. And ideally, and in fact, there was no loss of the other favorable characteristics of the glass ionomer. And if you were one of those people that had to make the parent happy by making it look beautiful, you could restore at least the dentin with the glass ionomer and the rest of the enamel with a resin, and that sandwich technique would work very, very well. Now, interestingly, there was a study done in 2015, so it's roughly 10 years ago, where it basically concluded that the fluoride-releasing materials can moderately reduce a white spot lesion. But the part that's really fascinating is that the high viscosity glass ionomers can arrest the enamel lesions. Why? Because of the fluoride release, as long as they're in intimate contact. So if you're doing a class 2, excuse me, and the adjacent tooth had a white spot lesion on it, ideally the glass ionomer is the way to go. Now, glass ionomers and resin-modified glass ionomers basically are an acid-base reaction. So once you started, it keeps going. So clinically, you don't have to wait after the top surface is hard for the child to stay in the chair. Once the top surface is hard and can chew on it, they can walk away. And over the next 24 to 48 hours, the material will get hard. Now, what's interesting is how do you as a clinician know what the advertising of a manufacturer is claiming is true? So there's a very easy way to test whether or not your material is truly a glass ionomer. I call it the light outs cure. And what you do is you mix up a little bit of the material, put it in a cupboard, close the door, and come look at it in the morning. If it's a true glass ionomer, whether that's your DAPN dish that you place the material in has water in it or not, the glass ionomer should be hard. If it's a resin, it will not be hard. There's no light to cure it. If it's a compomer, same thing, won't set. And in fact, there was one particular manufacturer who shall remain nameless for the moment, who claimed that their material was, in fact, a resin-modified glass ionomer. That's what their advertising was. And subsequently, I think it was 5 to 10 years later, if you look at their instructions, they are now referred to as a resin. It was never a glass ionomer. At best, it was a compomer.
So let me ask you a question. Given that case in this country versus other countries, when a manufacturer actually is engaged in advertising, which knowingly or not is actually inaccurate based on science, how does that happen?
I'm sighing, Gerry, because probably a quarter of my patients earned their living on Madison Avenue in New York. And there are ways of couching things that exempt you from lying, basically.
Exempt you from lying. Interesting concept. Okay.
I mean, I always had the attitude, and in fact, I got it from you. And I got it from Martha Ann Keels, which was clinical dentistry based on science. If I don't have a documented paper from more than one from a referee journal that says X, Y, or Z is going to work, I don't do it. And my other rule, which I did from the day I started practice, which was if I wouldn't put it in my own daughter's mouth, I'm certainly not going to put it in somebody else's mouth. And that just has held me in good stead over the years. So
I think for those of you that are trying to make some marketing value of all of this, other than doing the right thing, which you're going to understand very clearly when by the time Jed is done, is your teams in your office, your front desk, the hygienist, the assistant, maybe everybody but the doctor herself. I would encourage them to explain to parents during these moments when you have some chatting going on. Well, Dr. Best spends a tremendous amount of time making sure that he is up to date with all the modern materials and the scientific basis for that. That's all the time it'll take. Now, for me to say that to for example, to say to a parent, well, I spend hundreds of hours going and making sure that I understand I'm doing this. You're like Bozo the button buster, oh boy, look how great I am. You can't do that. You can't. It's ugly. It's arrogant. But your team can do it. Your team can talk about the effort that you go to make sure that clinical decisions based on science. As Jed said, that's actually from the Martha Ann Keels, but that's important. These people understand this. This is what will set you apart from others that either don't know or very sadly don't care. Jed?
okay. So let me just show you some comparisons. These are with resin modified glass ionomers. The slides I'm going to show you come from 3M, so they're not going to talk about some other competitors' products. But you can see that Keytech Nano is not that dramatically less polishable or less polished, shall we say, than the composite is. I will tell you that I love GC America. I'm going to talk about another product that they have that I think's tremendous. Fuji 2LC was not one of my favorites. And when I was using a resin modified glass ionomer, Keytech Nano and one other one, which I'm going to show you shortly, were my preferred products.
So you might want to make note of that. You just said Keytech Nano, you were happy with that.
Yeah, you're going to see a slide in a minute.
Okay.
So here's post polishing. the slide on the left is the part on the slide on the right, but you can see that Keytech Nano polished after composites is pretty similar. And obviously 3M is going to show you how their product looks better than anybody else's. That's a given. But I'm also telling you from clinical experience that I found that Keytech Nano looked great, and you'll see it very shortly. This is what made Keytech Nano polishable and wear much better, which was the fact that it had nanoparticles in it, which Equia Forte HT by GC, which is a high viscous glass ionomer, pure glass ionomer, also has. The other nice thing about all of these is that they're radio opaque, but I will warn you that, and I don't have an answer for this. I've asked people in industry and no one seems to know the answer of the following, that on occasion, when using a resin modified glass ionomer, not a pure glass ionomer, there'd be a radiolucent line near the base of the box. The child was never sensitive. There was never secondary caries. So at the beginning, when I saw them and I would rip them out and redo them, the box was totally clean. I still, to this day, do not know whether or not it was the primer that was washed out. Was it a short fill? I just don't know. So I'd rather convey that to you so that you know to be on the lookout for it. I can tell you that in all the years that I used pure glass ionomer, which was about the last 3 or 4 years of my practice, once I discovered something, which I'm going to be discussing with you, I never saw this problem.
So, hey, Jed.
Yeah.
The notes I'm making here, now you can answer this later if you want. I just don't want to overlook it. For a clinician looking in a patient/child's mouth, other than the incredibly obvious, let's say that now the doctor is aware that the materials they're using, there is a much better choice. Under what circumstances, again, other than the obvious, would you say, well, you really should replace that restoration with a different material? Can you answer that, or is it?
Yeah, to me, if the margins were staining, if they were wearing too much, if it was chipping, those are all grounds to either reline it, because you can acid etch it and put flowable or pure resin on it if it's going to last only a year or so. Or I would just tell the parent I didn't like it and I would redo it, and I would redo it for free.
Okay, so once more, just kind of repeat that so everybody, clinically, if you saw these things, this would be the actions you should consider taking. Would you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I would redo it. If it was a chipped filling, if it was wearing excessively, and I can tell you that Equia and Nano and the other material I'm going to show you in a second did not wear excessively, but if it wore excessively, to me, that's grounds to redo it.
To redo it, or you said something about patching it up.
Oh, if it's with Fuji 2, when it would wear too much or would turn sort of a yellowish color, I could as easily just reline it because it's glass ionomer. I can etch it, and I could etch it, put bonding agent, and put a pure resin composite over the top. So it'd be a sandwich technique. And the advantage is that we're doing pediatric dentistry, so these teeth are going to fall out at 11 or 12 or 13. So I just want to buy the child enough time that it doesn't alter their bite, that they can chew and function well.
Okay, so you were talking about primary teeth or deciduous teeth. Do you have the same criteria for permanent teeth?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had a rule. I mean, I don't mean to sound obnoxious, but I already have my Porsche. I can only drive one at a time. I've never deprived myself of a toy or a camera that I didn't want. So I didn't need to be, there's a Yiddish word, you'll laugh, it's called a chazer. It means a pig. I mean, I want to make lots of money like everybody else does, but I also need to sleep at night.
Yeah, there's the bottom line is, it's real simple. Are you doing the right thing? And I'm quite biased because one of my degrees is in pediatric dentistry. I suppose there's pediatric dentists out there that are just money motivated, and that's their yardstick, that's their scorecard. They've just got their PhD in that, but I just prefer to think that there's just very few pediatric dentists who behave that way, is a general thought. Jed, rock on.
So I defy you to find it. To find it. There's a DO on the first primary molar, and there's an MO on the second primary molar. This particular restorations were made with Keytech Nano, but Ionolux by Voco will give you the exact same result, exact same wear characteristics. They don't break, they don't fall out. The only advantage of Ionolux over Keytech Nano is that you do not need a primer for Ionolux. And that's by manufacturer's instructions.
And that's it. There's no other than that. It's just personal preference.
Basically, yeah. I mean, do you want to give the money to Solventum or do you want to give it to Voco, which is German? Otherwise, they both look absolutely beautiful.
And do you think are those the top players?
As of 7 months ago, the last time I checked, yep.
Okay.
You're going to see something at the end that's a little caveat, but not against these materials, about something else.
All right.
This is just for base of reference, so everybody can see it. This is Equia Forte HT. Not quite as aesthetic as the resin modifieds, but pretty damn good. I never had a patient complain, or more importantly, a parent complain. The biggest issue would be how long does it take to get hard? And we're going to deal with that in about 30 seconds. You also should know that the first publication that I know of that mentioned this was in 1982. This is the Indiana University Pediatric Dentistry alumni. Paul Starkey, who was faculty at IU, wrote an article about indirect pulp therapy in children. And I didn't show you all of the article, but he mentions that this is a highly underutilized technique. Susie Seal, may she rest in peace, really popularized this technique over the last 20 to 30 years. And Starkey's comment was, though, that he didn't feel that there was a material available that would seal off the dentin sufficiently so that the indirect pulp therapy would work. I'm going to get to that again in a minute. The American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, at least 3 separate times, has devoted a total journal to this. This is just one example, but basically indirect pulp therapy has a higher success rate than anything else. The last study I saw, it had a 94.5% success rate versus MTA versus ferric sulfite. Personal opinion, whether you're going to use formicrosol or not.
Yeah. That statistic was what again? It was how many percentage? 90 what?
Roughly 94 for, I think it was over 5 years for indirect pulp therapy. Now, this is not irreversible pulpitis. This is reversible pulpitis. So it was 94.4 versus 88 point something versus 83.
So I would encourage you to remember it's 94.4, call it 94. That's 6% that, I don't know, what would you say, Jed, that are they failed, they're unacceptable?
No, something happened to them. But the point is, I mean, I'm happy to supply this PowerPoint to anybody. I can make a PDF, and if anyone wants it, I'm happy to give it to them. And they can just look up Jim Call, who's published a lot of this stuff in our journal. And you can see all the studies that have been done. There's been a lot.
But just remember, it's not 100%. So, you know, the saying in statistics is to the patient with a problem, statistical data has no meaning. So, you know, if it's 1 in 1,000, but you're the one, for you, it's 100%. My point is just this is, yeah, I would want to go with the most reliable, highest percentage possible of materials, but you have to be realistic about your expectations.
I should mention that if you're going to use formicrosol and you're in a litigious community, be aware that the WHO, even though we're no longer members of it, apparently, is considered one of the precursors of formicrosol, is considered a carcinogen. So I don't know, you know, comfort zone wise, I know some schools won't even teach it anymore.
Do you agree with that?
Having been married to a lawyer, I still am married to the lawyer. I think there are better alternatives. I mean, the worst case scenario is, God forbid, something happens to a child. Their attorney says, are you aware that formicrosol is a carcinogen? If you say no, you're illiterate. If you say yes, you're cavalier. I don't think you win either way. So I think it's a lot safer to not, if it's going to go to a jury trial, excuse me, you're just a lot safer to use an alternative material.
Yeah, I think that answered the question. My interpretation is, why would you do that?
Well, so in 2021, this is the Journal of Materials Research and Technology. Again, if you haven't figured this out yet, I don't just read normal journals. I'm sort of weird. So they concluded that the acid-base glass ionomer can act as a solid-state buffer to the heat and to everything else. So this seals the dentin off. So this helps indirect pulp therapy success rate significantly. Now, the Journal of Dental Materials, another journal that you will never read, I do, they compared Ionostar, which is a pure glass ionomer, to Ionolux, which is the resin modified, and to Grandioso, which is a resin. And what they found was that the only one that really was effective in terms of protecting the biofilm was actually the high viscosity GIC. So I'm leading you up. So if you haven't caught it up yet, is there a way to make a high viscosity GIC in your workflow, in your practice, viable? Okay, so only time the biofilm was reduced was with the HVGIC. There is some controversy as to which releases more fluoride, an RMGI, resin modified, or an HVGIC. Now, interestingly, during COVID, so this is data from one of the companies that measured their sales from 2017 to 2021. And if you look carefully, you can see that the sales of glass ionomer was basically static. Did not increase, not decrease. Now, this is only in the US. Glass ionomer is far more popular in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the UK, and part of Europe. But in the US, sales were totally static, which is kind of weird because there's a ways of using GICs that don't require a priming agent, don't require a bonding agent. And so the amount of aerosol you have to create is less. So you would think people would do it, especially with an electric handpiece, which creates less of an aerosol than an air-driven handpiece does, and that's well documented. So I got one of the companies and I asked how well they're doing in the marketplace. And they reinforced what I just showed you in numbers, that the overall share of GICs in the US marketplace hadn't changed. GC may have taken over for a while, then 3M, but in terms of the overall sales of GICs, no difference. My theory, and it is only a theory because I can't prove it, is that one, glass ionomers had a rap against them for not being aesthetic and questionable properties, and it wasn't developed here. So US companies and people who sold products in the US had a 10-year jump over GICs in selling resins into the United States. So let's talk about the future. This was published, I believe, in February 2022. This is Gordon Peterson's Clinician report. And what I find real fascinating is when I read this, I went, oh boy, this is really significant, yet it doesn't seem to have moved the needle a whole lot. But what he basically claimed was that logic indicates that in young, high caries risk patients, the preventive choice would be glass ionomer, not resin. Resin is no different than amalgam in the sense that it plugs the hole. Glass ionomers at least have the potential for remineralization and reducing the chance of decay in the adjacent tooth. He also stated that until dental manufacturers solve the 2% shrinkage problem inherent in dental resins, that they will continue to be a problem, and that has not been solved. If you remember way back when, I told you that glass ionomers bond directly chemically to the tooth, and its coefficient of thermal expansion is the same as dentin. So you don't get the same kind of shrinkage. So again, from his report, he said resin-modified glass ionomers and the new conventional glass ionomers, which are the high viscosity ones, should be the restoration of choice. Why? Because of their fluoride release and their improved properties. For the sake of completeness, I've listed for you the RMGIs that he was referring to, which was Fuji 2 Automix, Voco Ionolux, Keytech Nano, and Riva LC. I can tell you that I've had the most experience with the two middle ones, but I've also used the Riva a fair amount. And with respect to pure glass ionomers, there's the Acquia Forte and Forte HT, the Ionostar by Voco, Keytech Universal Applicat, and Riva Self Cure. The thing about Keytech Universal is it does not require a priming agent, according to 3M. But aesthetically, Acquia Forte HT is stunning. Probably over the last 4 years when I was in practice, most of my restorations were Equiforte.
Now
And I
you,
hope you're all asking yourself, yeah, but it takes so long to get hard. And I'm going to show you it doesn't.
yeah. So there's kind of the bottom line you might want to make note of as far as what Jed's preferences were with all this experience and study. You just heard it.
So interestingly, in the same article that in Christensen's, they then asked a bunch of pediatric dentists, their study sample, what's their material of choice? And they all went resin composites. I suspect, can't prove, that's because dental schools don't teach glass ionomers particularly. They teach resin composites.
Yeah. Well,
But
psychologically, what's going on there, and this is certainly not original with me. It's psychiatrist's comment is change connotates wrongness. People hate change, even when it's a change for the better, which is what this would be. Humans are creatures of habit, and then the forces of nature and the Almighty forbid that your team has got to actually learn about a different material. Um, I think that has a lot to do with it.
so again, from Christensen, research and clinical observation support the use of glass ionomers and RMGIs with patients who are in caries challenge, from moderate to large preps. I can tell you this particular article has yet to be approved for publication. I just reviewed it 2 days ago for our journal, where they compared Equiforte to a particular brand of composite, and there was no statistical difference between either of them. And I cannot remember whether it was 24 or 48 months. In fact, the higher success rate was the glass ionomer, but it was not statistically significant.
Now, maybe I was tuned out for a second, but Jed is the section editor for the American Academy of Pediatric Dentist Journal. And is it materials, or am I
Yeah, I
misstating?
tend to do, Noel has me do mostly material science.
Yeah.
So here's the big but. What can we do to make glass ionomers more clinically attractive to the clinician? The problem with glass ionomers, the nuance, it still takes 2 minutes to get hard. 2 minutes in the life of a little kid sitting in the chair with a rubber dam on is like eternity. Well, here's the secret. It's heat. And you're going to ask yourself, how do you apply the heat to a restoration and not burn the child? Well, in 2003, this study was done. It was published in 2004. ACTA is the dental school in Amsterdam. And they originally used an ultrasound device to vibrate the glass ionomer so it would command set and get hard faster. Then Raymond von Duin, who is the middle author, decided that there was another way to do that because most people, well, I suspect that most people listening are too young to know what a gold foil is. But people used to really bitch and moan and complain if they had to have a gold foil in their mouth. So he discovered that heat would do the same thing. And the part that's amazing is that he also found an increase in strength, and that this is well over 20 years ago, and it still hasn't caught on. But notice where the study's done. The study's not done in the United States. It's not done in North America. And most of the studies on material science in this area are coming from Brazil, from Germany, and from the Far East. Now it gets real interesting. I'm going to show you a bunch of papers from various different journals. The heat transmission through the cement was insufficient to cause pulpal damage. It's agreed, with very few papers to support it, that an increase in intrapulpal temperature of 5.5 degrees centigrade is enough to cause the pulp to die. Just keep that in mind. Another journal. Heating the glass ionomer increased the bond strength, improved the properties of the GIC restoration, and can be recommended as a command set method. Heating the GIC during setting decreased microleakage, improved marginal adaptation, excuse me, and the GIC restoration is suitable for clinical practice. Australian Dental Journal. If you recall, remember I told you that it's much more popular in New Zealand and in Australia than it is here. Another paper. Heat treatment of GICs during setting improved the microhardness of the material, and the heat was coming from the polymerization heat of it for 60 seconds from the curing light. It's not a halogen light, it's an LED light. This one was really fascinating. This is from the Journal of Prosthetic Dentistry. And they basically said that thermolight polymerization accelerated the development of flexural strength, and that the light output was most effective for GC products if the light was over 1,000 milliwatts and 1,200 milliwatts for Keytech molar. They didn't do Equia Forte. One last one. It's heat's not, it's not the power, it's not the milliwatts, it's the milliwatt heat that's produced is the key. And in this study, they took 4 glass ionomers, Glass Ionomer FX Ultra, which honestly, I have no idea where that's from, Keytech Universal Applecat, Equia Fill, which is the precursor to Forte, and SDI, which comes from Australia. Now, this is an interesting study. Dr. Asha Patel was one of the residents at UAB. I think she graduated 2 years ago. As I mentioned, or Gerry did, I also teach at UAB, is one of the places that I go to lecture. So we did a sort of Rube Goldberg-ish study. We were given a whole bunch of extracted molars. I chopped off the roots. We put thermocouples through the root into the pulp. Cut a prep, a traditional class 1 prep, filled it with either Equia Ionostar Reaver or Universal Applecap, and measured the pulpal temperature. None of them went over 5.5 degrees. So in my discussions with Richard Price at Dalhousie, we've now started some studies there. We are presenting an initial study at AADOCR in, was it 3 weeks, I think? And if you look carefully, you can see that the Equia Forte set time is decreased by roughly 1/3. Fuji 2, almost half. Fuji Sem, half. And interestingly, and I do not have the answer yet why the GC Fuji 9 did not. My suspicion is it has something to do with the internal chemistry of the product, but that is yet to be determined. I have a phone call into people at GC to see if they can help me understand why it didn't. The bottom line is that I'm not using Fuji 9 anymore. I would be using Equia Forte HT anyhow because it's far more aesthetic. And we've already seen that in a 20-second amount of exposure to the light, it's already dropped 1/3. I can tell you in clinical practice, I used to set Equia Forte in 40 to 60 seconds. That was my primary restorative material for the last 3 or 4 years. Never had a problem. So lastly, another interesting study. This is published in 2022. It compared Keytech Universal, Equia Forte, and SDI to Z250. And the 3 glass ionomers held up very well in comparison to the Z250 from small to medium-sized class 2 cavities. So there are more and more studies showing that glass ionomers are holding up as well as resins. Now the question is, how do you make it clinically viable? And I think I have now demonstrated to you that the heat from the curing light, you can't trust me that every curing light does it. I can tell you that the 3M lights are positively work, and I can also tell you that the Velo lights positively work. Now there's a new light out by Pinkwave called the Pinkwave. It's a quad light. It has the 2 wavelengths that the FDA and ISO acknowledge are appropriate for dentistry, but it also has a blue light in it. I'm sorry, a red light in it and an infrared light. There are now 2 studies that I have read. One says it does increase the heat and does nothing for the setting of any resin material. We're not talking about glass ionomers. And a more recent study that literally was sent to press, and I have the precursor of the article. I just read it this morning, but not fast enough to make another slide, that says that it does decrease the set time as well of the resin and increases the amount of conversion of the double bonds being broken into single bonds. So to be determined. And we're now studying, the next step is to see how the Pinkwave does with glass ionomers. Before I finish, I need to alert you to one other thing that I think is really important. Bioactivity is a catch-all word used in dentistry, and it's used very, very loosely. There is no ISO standard to discuss bioactivity. These are the two standards at the moment, 233.17 and 190.90. Neither one of them has anything to do with dentistry. It's basically orthopedics. I also thought you'd all be interested to know that the first pure bioactive material was discovered in 1969 by Larry Hench, who was a PhD scientist at the University of Florida, and it was used for bone repair. What is bioactivity? Well, here's two common definitions. Dentistry has the availability of bioactive restorative materials for several decades in the form of fluoride-releasing material. That's glass ionomer. Here's a second definition. Calcium and fluoride are components of hydroxyapatite or fluorapatite in a tooth structure, and they release anything that releases calcium would be considered bioactive. Again, glass ionomer. But what I really want to introduce you to is this. This was published in 2025, like last month. It comes from Brazil. And what they were looking at was secondary caries and retention loss in posterior restorations. And it was a systematic review, not a single study. And you will see in terms of clinical significance, I basically wrote it as they presented it. The review provides evidence that bioactive materials offer no significant advantage over traditional composites. So if you have some salesman selling you on it's bioactive, isn't it great? Show them this article. It's no different. It's the same way that I told you years ago that a particular material that came out and claimed it was a resin modified glass ionomer and over time was proven not to be. It was probably a compomer more than anything else. And now when you read their instructions, you have to use an acid etch and use a bonding agent. Well, if you have to use an acid etch and a bonding agent, it ain't a glass ionomer. So that's the last of the slides. Again, if you wish, you can reach me. Here's my email and the phone number again. And don't forget to put Fireside in. And I guess, Gerry, there are some questions.
Yes. Dr. Bloom is asking, do you have a preference for polishing materials? What would be your clinical preference?
In primary teeth, I never polished it.
Okay, moving right on.
I trimmed it with a fissurotomy burr on the marginal ridge or a 7901, adjusted the occlusion with a number 4 burr. And primary teeth doesn't really have a whole lot of secondary anatomy. So both Equia, Ketac, and Voco held up beautifully. They did not to be polished. They're smooth when they come out.
And how about permanent teeth?
Prism, who is it? There's a couple of rubber wheels would be more than sufficient. Beyond that, nothing.
Here's an anonymous attendee. No, their first name is anonymous and their last name is attendee. They go by Dr. Attendee.
Okay.
What is the recent data saying as far as amount and duration of fluoride release for the HVGIC materials?
That's somewhat controversial. You have a maximum bolus of fluoride release in the first 24 to 48 hours. Then it goes to a much lower level steady state. I have never been able to find a definitive amount that steady state is, nor have I found any articles that say that minimum steady state's enough to protect the adjacent tooth. However, logic says it's better than nothing. And 40, well, let's see, the first time I heard Susie Seal was probably 36 years ago. So all I can tell you is from 36 years of clinical experience, when I was trained that if you do a DO, let's say on a first primary molar, and you see a white spot on the second primary molar, you're cutting the prep on that tooth as well. After I listened and heard Susie speak, I never cut a prep on the adjacent tooth, and that white spot never became decay.
Nice. Excellent. Well, wait a minute. Another from the effervescent Dr. Campbell, who would like you to know this is the best glass ionomer talk he has ever heard.
Well, if that amazing Dr. Campbell is Dennis, hi, Dennis.
What is the recent data? I'd like you to answer this question live. Given the current paranoia from the FDA about fluoride, um, do you think glass ionomers will be an issue?
There is a recent study that was published in JDR, was either this month or last month. It was a systematic review of fluoride. And fluoride, this is another article in the box of the pro-fluoride people that says there is no pathology with water fluoridation. I can get Dr. Campbell the article if he wants it. I immediately had called Dr. Keels about it, and Martha Ann already had the article. So all I can say is that, I practiced in Manhattan, and we used to have all kinds of bizarro parents come in and go, do you autoclave your instruments? And after you say yes, they would then ask you what's an autoclave. I suspect I still wouldn't have problems with telling them if they asked that there was fluoride in the restorative material. The people that are going to not want that material in their mouth, there's tons of articles I could convince them with showing that whatever else they want in their mouth is probably worse, and that the only thing that's totally safe at the moment is gold. And yet I probably have some nutso parents that would want a gold in their kid's primary molar, but then they're going to go find another dentist because I refuse to treat them.
Well, yeah, I would hasten to remind everybody that facts do not change behavior. So you can show parents, even those that want to see the literature or say they do, they're just going to say, I don't believe it.
Yeah, the other thing I used to do, I offer this, I'm not suggesting it, but I'm offering it. If I had a parent that was really disagreeing with me, I went, that's great. Let me give you the names of other people to get other opinions. I didn't want to be responsible for putting something in I didn't believe in. And if they came back because they were finally convinced, that's great. And if they didn't come back, then that's great too. At least they're getting the service that they want.
Yeah, my comment under those circumstances was always at a certain point, I'd say, I am really quite concerned that I won't be able to meet your needs.
Yeah.
I
Interestingly, I
didn't,
had parents that didn't want topical fluoride, but had no problem accepting fluoride in the restorative material.
well, like I said, facts don't matter. It's what people believe. And that's the kindest possible thing I could say to people is that I'm concerned I'm not going to meet your needs. I didn't say won't be able to, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking you need to go find somebody else. And
And
then
Dennis, thank you.
then if they decided they wanted to come back for me to do their orthodontics, is what I'm getting at, is I would have a powwow with them, well, I don't want to start something here that's going to be uncomfortable for both of us. I didn't have to do it very often, but what I didn't do is behave like a child and make them angry. I used to do that,
No,
but
I had a few that, disagreed with me, and I went, great, here's the names of other people. And I had the supreme pleasure once of a parent wanting to come back, and I basically said, no, I think you're better off where you are.
yeah.
But Dennis, thank you for your nice comment about the lecture.
One of the upcoming fireside chat FaceTimes is going to be with Larry Gerald, the orthodontist lawyer, and he has plenty to say about this in a way that is very easily understandable because Larry is very New York and very close to, but not quite blunt trauma. One more question from Gene. Are there any new materials besides the ones that you've mentioned that we might be expecting to hit the market that we could be interested in?
That's actually a very interesting question, and I thank you for asking it because it reminds me to mention something to all of you, which is that with what's going on in DC, unless the manufacturers are submitting their stuff to the ISO standard, the approval process, I would assume, is going to be slowing down. I do have a plan to ask some colleagues at AADOCR that are in industry what they're doing about all of this. But I would suspect that the product pipeline is going to have to change a little bit. Oftentimes these manufacturers would change, I don't know, a percentage of a particular material reapply to the FDA, get their 510(k), and then, hail this new material. They're not going to be able to do that if it isn't anybody in the FDA. So I think that's an open question. I certainly have not seen anything new in the scientific literature, not in the throwaways that we get. And I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't see them in dental products or dentistry today. And there's all kinds of stuff going on in sort of basic science, but nothing commercial available that I am aware of, other than the fact that this one study came out and said that bioactive materials are basically useless compared to resins.
Well, here's a unfair question for you, Jed, and a provocative thought. Have you ever thought about coming out with a newsletter? He's going to spit up his water. Out your nose, Jed.
The brief answer is no. Maybe you and I should do one.
Oh, here we go. Now that's a smart answer right there.
No, I can't. I can conceptualize sentences, but to give you, when I did my master's thesis, my poor advisor kept ripping everything up, in red because my language was so horrible. And it's an argument that I'm giving a talk on AI in a couple of weeks. And one of the things I'm mentioning, which I find fascinating, is the budget that Apple had for R&D in 2024 was roughly, bear with me, $34 billion. If they can't get the dictation on their iPhones correct, and that dictation's been around since at least 2015, that doesn't help me when I dictate email, because I got to go back in and check the grammar and the spelling, and half the time I can fix the spelling, but I can't fix the grammar. I got to give it to my wife, who's the lawyer, who corrects it. So if I had an editor that could clean up my grammar, that's something to think about. But I think we should do one.
Well, here, I'll tell you what I would consider is I don't want to do a newsletter. I dictate most of my texts and emails. Hey, I do it by dictation, and then I go back and clean it up. Well, it seems to me that it would be a lot more fun, a lot more interesting, and a lot more with it, in the parlance of our times, if we did a video.
That's cool. I'm game for that.
Video would be great, and that way they can. I think that's a lot more interesting. Plus, we can both throw in our strange and sometimes opposite sense of humor.
I'm happy to do that. That'd be fun.
That would be fun.
It could be the Jed and Gerry show.
I like it.
Or better yet, the Gerry and Jed show.
No, I like it, Jed and Gerry. I like it. It's more alphabetical. But that would be a very interesting to do. It is, as Kevin O'Brien says, whenever we felt like doing it. And I would wonder it now, Allison. I know you have to make sure that. So I'm just saying, I would wonder if Fireside might not be interested in having such a thing some way or another. Now, for Fireside, their generosity with all of you has been, you don't have to be a Fireside member to hear everything Jed had to say. And I think now that you have heard what he had to say, you understand why I said Jed is, without argument, one of the top people in the world in explaining this stuff and getting to the point. But Fireside made a decision that it would be open access and not just to our Fireside members. Now, I don't own any part of Fireside. Jed does not own any part of Fireside. But I'm quite impressed with their approach. It is, for those of you that are not pediatric dentists, and I'll have Allison say a few things about the Fireside in the community, but it's just for pediatric dentists. Now, don't get all excited over that. Let's not get nuts. You're leaving me out. Now, take it easy. You have your own clubs too. Allison, give us a few more words about Fireside.
Thank you, Dr. Gerry. And we were just getting in the Q&A a few more comments saying that Dr. Green said, love Jed and Gerry, and a few more comments that people would be very interested in the Jed and Gerry show. So I absolutely look forward to that. And we will talk about how we can make that happen. As Dr. Gerry said, thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited to bring this series to this community. And we have, I think it has been, as someone who didn't know anything about Glass Ionomer before it started, I feel very well educated now. But as Gerry mentioned, Fireside is really what we're trying to do is just build a network of independent pediatric dentists. And why? We believe that we're better together. So if we can unite and come together and build a group that has unmatched purchasing power in the pediatric dental community, we can really do some special things. So namely, the number one thing that gets for you is savings and discounts on clinical supplies and payment processing. And ultimately also brings you sessions like this. So unique CE sessions, unique discussion boards, and hopefully one day a podcast with Dr. Jed and Dr. Gerry. But ultimately what we're doing is giving independent pediatric private practice dentists that buying power that traditionally you'd only find if you joined a large corporation or a DSO. So I will send out the recording of this session to everybody that registered. So you will get this whether you're a Fireside member or not. Fireside members, I'll post it in the app, and then we will definitely blast out the next couple of sessions. As Dr. Gerry mentioned, we've got a few on the horizon. Dr. Larry Gerald will be joining us to talk ethics and the law as it relates to pediatric dentistry. But we are just so excited for all of these sessions. And again, thank you to Dr. Gerry for curating this amazing group of experts, including Dr. Best, who I did not know was also such a talented photographer, but now I'm very interested in learning more about his photography as well. So thank you.
Sorry, what's your website? Because you really should look at what Jed's doing. It is really breathtaking.
Thank you.
And watching the evolution, because we've been friends for decades, has also been quite remarkable. What's the website, Jed?
Oh, it's easy. It's jedbest.com. By the way, Allison, if you want, I'm happy to send you a PDF of the PowerPoint that you can distribute if anybody wants it. That's
for sure. I'll include that, a link to your photography portfolio and the recording of this session. So, and if you're interested in more information about Fireside, you're interested in learning, we can do a personalized savings analysis for each of you that looks at your clinical supply spend, your payment processing, and compares it to what we're able to do. We would love to put that together for you. So I'll include all that information in the follow-up email that I will send out later today.
And when you do that, Allison, maybe you would list the other people that we have scheduled, like Reza Ardalan out of Florida on marketing, fabulous, and Lee Boyd on the use of Invisalign in the primary and the mixed dentition.
Absolutely, yes. We'll include the full schedule of upcoming FaceTime sessions with you. So,
well, Jed, thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks for everybody for listening.
I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great weekend, and we will see you at the next one, hopefully.
Allison, we hope everybody has what type of weekend, please?
A dandy weekend, as you would say.
Okay, thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.